She had been called a kitchen girl in her own house. By a man who had arrived in a carriage she could have bought twice over, with what the kitchen had earned that month. He said it to the footman, not to her face. That was the particular species of contempt Lord Prentice carried, the kind that does not bother to aim itself, the kind that assumes the target will not answer back. Tell that kitchen girl to have something ready. This will not take long. Cecily had heard it from the kitchen. She was at the work table, her hands still warm from the morning's bread, the coin ledger open beside her, showing a number that would have made Lord Prentice's land assessor weep. She heard it clearly. The Dunmore Hall back corridor carried sound the way certain silences carry weight. She closed the ledger. She took off her apron, folded it over the back of the chair, straightened her collar. She walked to the drawing room. Lord Prentice was already arranging his documents on the table when she entered. He had 2 witnesses at the door, a land commission instrument laid flat, and the bearing of a man who had decided the morning would last 20 minutes. Grey side whiskers. A coat worth more than the estate had cleared in any single month before she arrived. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing faces do when a person appears in a room where they were not expected. "I don't require the cook," he said. "I am not here in the capacity of cook," Cecily said. She crossed to the writing desk in the corner and opened the left-hand drawer. 3 documents placed there 3 days ago, exactly for this moment. She set them on the table beside his instrument. Flat, evenly spaced, no hesitation. These are signed contracts between the Dunmore estate and 3 separate provisioning clients, none of which fall within the jurisdiction of the Land Commission. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that cannot be unhappened. Lord Prentice looked at the contracts. He looked at Cecily. He looked at Edmund, the Duke of Dunmore, who had been standing at the mantelpiece since before she entered and had not moved or spoken once. She had been at Dunmore 41 days. Nobody in that room knew what those 41 days had built. Nobody except Edmund and Pip, and Sergeant Finch's 43 men who had eaten her stew in the rapid focus silence of soldiers, tasting something worth tasting for the first time in months. Lord Prentice did not know any of that yet. He was about to. 6 weeks earlier, a woman at a domestic agency in York had looked across a ledger and told Cecily Wren something she was not meant to take as encouragement. Dunmore. She was younger than Cecily, better dressed, and wore the satisfaction of someone who has just secured a superior position and wants the room to know it. "They've sent 3 women to Dunmore this year, all back within the fortnight." She lowered her voice for the pleasure of not lowering it. "The Duke is ruined and foul-tempered, and the house is a ruin itself. I wouldn't go if they doubled the wage." The agency clerk, a Mrs. Hollis, did not look up from her ledger. Cecily looked at the woman beside her, then at Mrs. Hollis. "When does the coach leave for Dunmore?" she said. She asked because she had 7 shillings and a broken portmanteau and a father 3 months dead who had left her nothing but books she could not eat, and the ability to run a household that no longer existed. She asked because the other option Mrs. Hollis had offered was a junior laundress position in Leeds. And she asked because something in the way the woman beside her had said ruined and foul-tempered and ruin itself, with that satisfied lowered voice, made Cecily want to see it for herself. She had spent 4 years keeping her father's house while consumption took him room by room. She could read Latin. She could calculate compound interest. She could manage a kitchen, a ledger, a difficult man, and a situation that everyone around her had already decided was hopeless. She was 26 years old, and she had been managing hopeless situations since she was 22, and she was very tired of being told what she could not do. The coach left at 7:30. The room Mrs. Farrow assigned her was off the scullery, not the room above the scullery, which was narrow but had a fireplace. The room beside the scullery, which was used for storing onions and had a window the size of a book propped open with a broken brick. Cecily stood in the doorway and looked at the narrow cot and the onion smell and the single candle on the shelf above it. "We have no other room available," Mrs. Farrow said from behind her. This was untrue. Cecily had walked past two closed doors on the way down the corridor that had the particular silent quality of empty rooms. She had noted the space under each door, the absence of firelight. They were not in use, they could have been. She set her portmanteau beside the cot, turned around and said, "I'll need the kitchen inventory by morning. And a proper accounting of what has been ordered against what has been received for the last quarter." Mrs. Farrow blinked. "That is not your concern. You are the cook." "I am," Cecily said, "and the cook cannot work without knowing what the kitchen has." She lit her candle and began to unpack. She met the Duke of Dunmore on the third morning. She had been there 2 days before she saw him, which was longer than she had expected. She had expected to be summoned. She had been told by Mrs. Hollis, and then by Mrs. Farrow, and then obliquely by Watts the footman, that His Grace's arrangements for a housekeeper-cook were somewhat unusual, that the position carried certain domestic expectations beyond the culinary, and that a contract had been drawn up that she had already signed. The contract was a form of marriage arrangement, not a conventional marriage. A practical one, drawn up between parties of agreed convenience, granting Cecily the protection of a titled household and granting the Duke the presence of a permanent housekeeper-cook who could not simply leave when the larder ran out. It was the sort of arrangement people had been making for centuries under various polite names, and Cecily had read it 3 times, recognized it for exactly what it was, and signed it because the alternative was the second option Mrs. Hollis had offered, which was a position as a junior laundress in Leeds. She had not expected to meet him in the kitchen. He came in before the household was awake. She was at the work table, going over the inventory she had compiled herself, because the kitchen had no written record of anything, and she heard the door from the corridor open and turned to find a man standing in the doorway who was not Watts and was not the boot boy Jem and was therefore the Duke. He was taller than the doorway suggested he ought to be. Dark coat, no cravat, jaw unshaved at this hour. He was looking at the inventory spread across her table. "You're up," he said. "I am always up," Cecily said. "The bread does not wait." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the loaves she had set to prove. "Mrs. Farrow said you'd last 3 days. Mrs. Farrow is welcome to her estimate." Cecily turned back to her inventory. "The kitchen has been ordering flour by the half-sack and losing 1/3 of it to damp. I intend to change that. I will need an account opened with Alderman Groves in the village, if you want proper supply terms." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "You've been here 2 days, he said. "Yes, and for 2 days the household has been eating what I managed from a depleted larder and 3 men who'd been cooking for themselves with no one telling them any different." She set down her pencil. "I can feed this household correctly, Your Grace. I can also tell you that it will cost less than it currently does if you will let me manage it." His expression did not change. He had the face of a man who had trained it not to. "The household accounts are mine," he said. "The kitchen accounts," Cecily said, "are the kitchen's. I am the kitchen." He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in a long time, not with contempt, not with pity, something that had no obvious name that sat behind his eyes and took its time. "You'll have your account with Groves," he said. He picked up the piece of bread she'd left cooling on the rack, broke a corner off, and ate it. His expression did not move, but he stood there a moment longer than he needed to. And when he turned and walked back through the door, Cecily turned away and let herself breathe. The bread had been good. She knew it, and he had stood there a moment longer than he needed to. She went back to her inventory. The household at Dunmore was 3 men and Mrs. Farrow and a garden boy called Pip, who was 8 years old, and the son of the former groundskeeper, who had died the previous winter and left Pip nowhere to go. Watts the footman had broad shoulders and a permanent expression of wary competence. Doyle the groom was 63, spoke only about horses, and had apparently been at Dunmore since before the current Duke's father was born. Tompkins the boot boy was 16, desperately earnest, and had twice already shown Cecily small acts of courtesy that Mrs. Farrow clearly disapproved of and that Cecily filed carefully in her memory. They had all expected her to leave. She could see it in the way they watched her, The particular quality of attention a household pays to a new person they have already decided is temporary. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, confronted the damp issue with a solution she had read about in a pamphlet her father had kept, renegotiated the flour order from Alderman Groves at better terms, discovered that someone had been drawing double wages for a laundry maid who had left 3 months ago, and produced food that Watts the footman described with the embarrassed precision of a man complimenting something he had not expected to like as a great deal better than before. Doyle said nothing, but he had begun bringing Pip to take supper in the kitchen rather than in the stables, which was how Cecily knew she had passed something. Mrs. Farrow watched all of it with the still, contained displeasure of a woman who had expected incompetence and found herself unable to manufacture it. On the 8th day, she moved Cecily's room, not to a better one. She moved Cecily's portmanteau and belongings from the onion room to a smaller room at the far end of the kitchen passage, which was in fact slightly worse because it had no window at all. She did not announce the move. Cecily returned from an errand to the village to find her things relocated, the new room's door standing open in a way that made very clear the gesture was deliberate. Cecily looked at the room. She looked at Mrs. Farrow's retreating back down the passage. She carried her things inside, set her portmanteau in the corner, and began to plan. It was Pip who told her about the garrison. Pip had a quality that 8-year-old boys who have grown up in large working estates sometimes develop, a comprehensive awareness of everything that passed within a quarter mile, absorbed in the way children absorb things, through gaps in conversations they were not supposed to hear, and through a general invisibility that adults consistently underestimated. "There's soldiers building a road," Pip told Cecily, while she was teaching him his letters at the kitchen table, which she had begun doing on the 4th day, because he could not read and because no one else had thought to teach him. "North side of the park. They've been there 6 weeks, and cook at Alderman Groves's house says they've got nothing but boiled beef and salt biscuit, and the men are half sick with it." Cecily set down the chalk. "How many soldiers?" 43, Pip said, with the precision of a child who had counted, plus 2 officers and a surveyor. "The road goes through His Grace's North Land, and the garrison commanders got a contract with the estate, but the contract's only for the land rights, not for provisions." Groves said nobody thought about provisions. Cecily looked at the window. Nobody thought about provisions. 43 men, plus officers, 3 meals a day, and nothing between them and half sick but boiled beef and salt biscuit for 6 weeks. She got up, went to her room, and retrieved the notebook she kept for household accounts. She sat back down, turned to a clean page, and began to calculate. She did not go to the Duke immediately. She went to the Duke's study on the 11th morning of her time at Dunmore, carrying the notebook. She knocked. She entered when he said to enter, which he did after a pause slightly longer than courtesy required, which was how she was learning to read him. He was at his desk, working through what looked like estate correspondence. He looked at the notebook in her hand. She opened it to the page she had prepared, set it on the desk in front of him, and let him read. "The garrison north of the park," she said. 43 soldiers and 3 officers building the military road. They have a provisions problem. No cook, no supply arrangement, and men who are working 12-hour days on cold-boiled beef. She pointed to the column of figures. 1 hot meal per man, twice daily, at a fair price accounting for my costs and the travel. That is the income against costs. That is the margin. The Duke looked at the figures. He looked at them for longer than she expected. "You've been here 11 days, he said. "Yes, and you have already surveyed the garrison's provisions situation." "Pip told me about the garrison. I surveyed the provisions situation myself, yesterday afternoon, when I walked the north track while Watts thought I was checking the kitchen garden." He looked up at her. Something in his face had shifted, barely the way a door shifts when the latch gives. "This margin," he said, "is conservative. I built in waste and weather, and 1 day in 10 when the road makes the journey impossible. The actual margin will likely be higher. You would need a cart." And someone to drive it. Doyle has a second cart he is not using, and I would need Tompkins 4 days a week for the driving. He would still have his other duties on the remaining days. She paused. I know you have concerns about how it appears. A duke's household woman driving provisions to a garrison. I have thought about that. She turned the notebook page. The arrangement need not be attributed to the household at all. It can run as an independent provisioning service. The income comes to the estate. The association with Dunmore need not be public. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. My father, he said, tried 3 different approaches to the North Lands in the course of his tenure and failed at all 3. He turned the notebook page back. You have been here 11 days, 12 this morning. He almost smiled. She could not be certain. It was the place a smile might have been. You'll have Tompkins 4 days a week, he said. And the cart, thank you, Your Grace. She picked up the notebook. She had reached the door when he said, Miss Wren. She turned. Cecily, he said. A correction or a choice, she could not tell which. If we are in the arrangement we are in, you may as well use my name when we are not in company. I am Edmund. She looked at him. He had returned to his correspondence. She walked back to the kitchen and stood at the work table for a long moment before she began to prepare the next day's provisions. Edmund. She filed it where she filed things she needed to think about later and went back to work. The first morning she took the cart north, Mrs. Farrow stood in the kitchen doorway and watched with the particular stillness of a woman who was certain this would fail and was settling in to enjoy it. You'll be back by noon, Mrs. Farrow said. When they don't buy. Cecily tied the last cloth over the crate and checked the lashings. I'll be back by 3, she said. When they've bought everything. She climbed up beside Tompkins. The boy was 15 and barely awake at this hour, his collar askew and his breath fogging in the cold. He flicked the reins. They went north. The garrison was exactly as Pip had described it. 43 men in various stages of grey exhaustion, working in frozen ground with the particular grim competence of soldiers who have decided that comfort, not something they can afford to want. The smell of the cook fire reached her half a mile before the camp did. Burnt fat and something sour underneath. The garrison quartermaster was a Sergeant Finch, a compact Yorkshire man with the manner of someone who has been suspicious of everything for 20 years and found the approach largely vindicated. He walked the length of the cart with his arms crossed. He read the chalkboard menu she had prepared. He looked at the price. That's double what we're paying now, he said. What you're paying now is for food that isn't fit for dogs, Cecily said. 3 of your men had sickness last week. I know because Pip counted the sick tent. She looked at him steadily. The first meal is given free. If your men don't think it worth the price, I'll drive away and you'll never see me again. Finch looked at her. He looked at the cart. He called the men in. She ladled stew for 45 minutes. The men ate in the rapid, focused silence of people who have not tasted anything worth tasting in a long time. Tompkins sold bread rolls from the second basket and ran out in 20 minutes. A corporal named Hughes bought 4 rolls himself and looked at Tompkins with a kind of desperate hope. Tomorrow, Cecily told him. Tomorrow, Hughes repeated, as if he needed to hear it said. When the cart drove back down the north track that afternoon, Tompkins reached under the seat and counted the coins in the box. He counted again. He turned to look at Cecily with the expression of someone who has witnessed something they do not have the vocabulary to fully describe. Mrs. Farrow will say it's beginner's luck, he said. Very likely, said Cecily. She had the reins. The track curved through the brown-grassed park, and above the line of oaks the towers of Dunmore Hall caught the afternoon light. We'll see what she says on Friday. She went back Friday, and the Monday after. By the 3rd week she had stopped explaining herself to Mrs. Farrow, who had stopped being in the kitchen doorway when the cart left, and had started appearing at it when the cart returned, watching the coin box with an expression Cecily could not fully name but recognized. The Duke knew. He did not ask her about the garrison runs directly, but once returning from the north track, she had seen him standing at the library window on the 1st floor, and he had not moved when she looked up. She had raised a hand in acknowledgement. After a moment he had raised one in return. That was not a small thing. She told herself it was a small thing. The garrison ran changed on the 4th week when Sergeant Finch mentioned, almost as an aside, that the engineers' company 3 miles east was laying drain culverts and eating worse than his own men had been. 3 miles east, Cecily said, down the Leicester Road. About 60 men and a supply problem that would make your hair stand up. She was back in the kitchen within an hour, the notebook open on the table, calculating. The second run required a second cart. She went to Edmund. This time she did not knock. She found him in the estate office, not the study. He looked up. She set the notebook on his desk. "I need the third cart," she said, "and I need Doyle for Tuesday and Thursday mornings only. The numbers are there." He read the numbers. He turned the page and read those too. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "Yes. The kitchen accounts have come down by 30%. 32, she said. "I corrected the flour contract and ended the double wage for the laundry maid who left." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "There was a double wage for a laundry maid who left. For 3 months before I came. I did not think at the moment to mention it until now." He put down the notebook. His jaw had done the thing she had learned to read as the nearest he came to amusement. "The third cart," he said, "is yours. And Doyle Tuesday and Thursday until he complains about his back, which he will do within the fortnight. I know. I have already arranged with him that Tompkins drives and he supervises from the seat." He was satisfied with that. Edmund looked at her. "You arranged that before you came to me," he said. "I arranged it in case you agreed. I would have unarranged it if you had not." "Would you?" "Probably not," Cecily said honestly, and something in his face broke open for just a moment, something warm and caught off guard, and then it closed again, and she picked up her notebook and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table for a long time without doing anything. That was not a small thing either. The man who arrived in the black carriage on the 37th day of Cecily's time at Dunmore was Lord Prentice. She knew who he was before Mrs. Farrow told her, because Doyle had mentioned him the week before with the particular brevity of a man whose opinion is too sharp to say out loud. He was the Crown's Land Commissioner for the Northern District. He held the provisional authority over estate contracts in the region, including the military road contract. He arrived with 2 secretaries and the manner of a man who had become used to entering houses whose occupants could not turn him away. Cecily was in the kitchen when he arrived. She heard the carriage. She heard Mrs. Farrow's elevated footsteps in the hall. She continued her work. She was carrying a soup tureen from the kitchen into the dining room when she met him in the corridor. He was speaking to his secretary and he stopped when he saw her, but the stop was the wrong kind, the kind that has contempt in it. "The kitchen girl," he said, to his secretary, not to her. "Someone tell the Duke his cook is in the passage." Cecily kept her hands level on the tureen. The broth inside it was very hot. "I am Mrs. Wren," she said. "I manage the household at Dunmore. If you require anything from the kitchen, you may speak to me directly." Prentice looked at her the way he would have looked at a chair that had spoken. "Mrs. Wren," he repeated. He glanced toward the drawing room where Edmund would be. "Run along." Cecily set the tureen on the hall table. She looked at Prentice. She looked at the closed drawing-room door, and then she looked at Prentice again. She picked up the tureen and walked to the dining room and set it on the table and stood in the doorway for a moment, her back to the hall, and counted to 7, and went back to the kitchen. By evening she had calculated, on a clean page in her notebook, 3 separate approaches to the situation that was coming. Because a man like Prentice did not arrive at a crumbling estate with 2 secretaries and no announced purpose, and a man like Prentice, who called her a kitchen girl in the corridor, was a man who thought her a piece of furniture in a house he had already decided he could rearrange. She was not furniture. She put the kettle on and began to plan. She did not have to wait long. Lord Prentice was at Dunmore for 2 days, and on the evening of the first day she heard, through the particular acoustic property of the Dunmore Hall back corridor that carried sound from the study like a speaking tube, what he had come to say. The military road contract. the provisioning rights attached to it. The 3 garrison companies that had grown, in the 6 weeks since Cecily had begun her runs, to encompass 5 garrison companies and the engineers' corps, the whole operation. Prentice wanted it, not as a purchase. He wanted it absorbed into the Crown's official supply chain, which meant he would take the income from the provisioning arrangement and pay a flat quarterly settlement to the estate, which settlement would be, by Cecily's quick calculation, about 1/3 of what the arrangement currently earned. He called this a rationalization. He explained it to Edmund with the patience of a man who has already decided the outcome. She heard Edmund's voice, quiet and even, asking questions. She could tell from the quality of the questions that he understood the numbers. She could also tell that Prentice had more formal ground to stand on than the questions could shift. In the morning she rose before the household and sat at the kitchen table and turned to the page in the notebook where she had written, 3 nights ago, her 3 approaches. She crossed out the first 2. Then she sat for a long time looking at the 3rd. "He can do it," Edmund said. He had found her in the kitchen. Not summoned her. Found her. That was a change she had noticed. The gradual shift from the Duke, who appeared in the kitchen before dawn, because he could not sleep, to the man who appeared there in the middle of the afternoon, because there was something he needed to say and the kitchen was where she was. "Legally," he said, "the provisioning rights are attached to the garrison contract, and the garrison contract runs through his office. I have had it looked at." He set a paper on the table, a solicitor's letter. "He can absorb it." "He can absorb the garrison provisioning," Cecily said. She had the notebook in front of her. "He cannot absorb the rest." Edmund looked at her. She turned the notebook so he could read the page she had been working on for the last 3 days. She had written it in her most careful hand, the way she had learned to write when her father was teaching her the value of making a case so clear that no argument could find a foothold in it. "The garrison contracts run through Prentice's office," she said. "But the engineers' corps contracts run through the Army Board, not the Land Commission. And the 2nd company I added last month, the drain culvert crew on the Leicester Road, those are county works, not Crown military. Prentice has authority over the Crown garrison contracts. He has no authority over county works contracts, and he has no authority at all over any private arrangement not attached to a Crown contract." Edmund looked at the page. He turned it. He turned it again. "If you separated the provisioning runs," he said, "the garrison runs go into Prentice's rationalization. Let him take them. The income from those runs is not the majority of what the arrangement earns now. The engineers and the county crews are the majority. And I have already been in contact, through Groves who knows the factor at Keswick, with the Earl's estate." Edmund looked up at her. "The Earl's estate," he said. "The Earl of Keswick is building a summer house on his north land. He needs to feed 50 workmen for 4 months. His factor has been looking for a reliable provisioning arrangement and has not found one." She met Edmund's eyes. "Keswick's estates are 30 miles south, entirely outside Prentice's jurisdiction. And the Earl's factor has offered to put a contract in writing." Edmund was still. She had learned to read his stillness. This one had something different in it, a quality she was only beginning to have a name for. "You wrote to Keswick's factor," he said. "I wrote to Groves, who wrote to the factor, who wrote back yesterday." She reached into her apron pocket and set the letter on the table beside the notebook. "I drafted a response this morning. I have not sent it." "Why not?" "Because it is your estate," Cecily said, "and because I wanted you to read it first." He picked up the draft. He read it. He turned it over and read the back. His hand went flat on the table in a way she had not seen before. "This is," he said, and stopped. He picked up the draft again and read a section she had calculated to the 4th decimal. "You have been here 40 days. 41. Miss Wren," he said. "Cecily," he caught himself. "Cecily, this letter, if Keswick accepts it, rebuilds what Prentice is trying to take and doubles it within the year. Roughly. Yes. Prentice will know. Prentice will know after the contracts are signed," she said, "and by then there will be nothing he can do, because nothing in what I have built touches his jurisdiction." Edmund looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the way he had looked at the inventory on the third morning, with the quality of attention she'd come to understand was not the Duke's public face, but something he gave very rarely and very carefully. "You planned this," he said, "before he arrived." "I planned 3 approaches before he arrived," she said. "This was the third." "What were the first 2? "The first was to challenge his authority on the garrison contracts. I discarded it when I read the solicitor's letter. The law is genuinely on his side for those. And the second—" Cecily paused. "The second was to give him what he wanted and leave." Edmund was very still. "Leave," he said. "The contract I signed does not bind me against my will. There are provisions in it. I read it carefully." She kept her voice even. "I discarded that approach also." "Why?" There was a long pause. In the kitchen there was the sound of the fire and the sound of the sleet beginning. Outside, and the sound of Pip somewhere above them doing his letters on the chalkboard she had put up in the passage. "Because there is work here worth finishing," she said, "and because I do not leave things unfinished." She picked up her notebook and moved toward the larder. "Send the letter to Keswick's factor," she said, "and do not tell Prentice anything until the contracts are signed." Prentice came back on a Thursday. He came with a formal instrument from the Land Commission and 2 witnesses and the expression of a who had decided that a conversation was no longer necessary and a document would be sufficient. Cecily was in the kitchen. She heard the carriage. She heard Watts open the door. She heard Prentice's voice in the hall, the particular carrying quality of a man who never speaks to servants quietly, because he does not think of quiet as something they are owed. She heard him say, in the hall, to Watts, "Fetch the Duke, and tell that kitchen girl to have something ready. This will not take long." She stood at the work table for a moment, with her hands flat on it and her eyes on the far wall. Then she took off her apron, folded it over the chair, straightened her collar, and walked to the drawing room. Edmund was there already, standing at the mantelpiece. His face was the public face. She had learned the difference. Prentice was arranging his documents on the table. His 2 witnesses stood by the door. Prentice looked up when she entered. "I don't require the cook," he said. "I am not here in the capacity of cook," Cecily said. She crossed to the writing desk in the corner and opened the left-hand drawer, where she had placed 3 documents 3 days ago. She had told Watts to leave that drawer undisturbed. She removed the documents and set them on the table beside Prentice's instrument. He looked at them. He looked up. "These are signed contracts," she said, "between the Dunmore estate and 3 separate provisioning clients, none of which fall within the jurisdiction of the Land Commission. The first is with the Earl of Keswick. The second is with the County Works surveyor for the Leicester Drainage Project. The third is with the Engineering Corps quartermaster, who has confirmed in writing that the engineers' provisions contracts run through the Army Board, not your office." She stood with her hands at her sides. "The garrison provisioning runs are yours to rationalize as you see fit. The rest is not." Prentice looked at the contracts. He picked up the Keswick document. His witnesses were watching him. Edmund had not moved from the mantelpiece. "You cannot simply arrange private contracts and expect them to hold against a Land Commission instrument," Prentice said. "The contracts are already signed and witnessed, and 1 copy of each has been deposited with a solicitor in York." Cecily kept her voice even. "You are welcome to challenge them in the appropriate court. I have set aside the document reference numbers in the event you wish to do so." She placed a final slip of paper on the table. "It would take some time. And the press in York is covering the Land Commission's activities with some interest lately, or so my father's former colleagues have mentioned." The room was very quiet. Prentice looked at the document reference slip. He looked at Cecily. He looked at Edmund, who had not spoken a word since she entered the room. "You brought this," Prentice said to Edmund, "this woman, into your estate, into a position of responsibility." "I arranged a cook," Edmund said for the first time since she'd entered. His voice was the quiet kind of quiet, the kind that has weight behind it. "I got a cook. I also got considerably more than I knew I was arranging for." He looked at Prentice. "I think you have what you came for," Edmund said. The garrison contracts. You may have them, as they are yours by law, and I will not waste either of our time contesting it. He pushed away from the mantelpiece. But the rest, Lord Prentice, is not yours. My household has made certain of that. My household. Cecily heard it. The witnesses heard it. Prentice heard it. Prentice gathered his documents. He did not take the reference slip. He looked at Cecily once more, the look of a man who is recalculating something and does not care to share the result, and then he gathered his witnesses and left. When the carriage had gone, Cecily stood in the drawing room for a moment and looked at the documents on the table. Edmund crossed to the table and stood beside her. Not behind her, beside her. 3 approaches, he said. This was the third. What would you have done if Keswick's factor had said no? Found a 4th approach, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Cecily, he said. She turned. He had the Keswick contract in his hand. He turned it to the signature line. Her name was there, and the estate name, and in the line that read arranged by, she had written only the estate's name. Your name is not on this contract, he said. The estate's interests are what the contract serves. Your name should be on it. He set it down, all 3 of them. She looked at the contracts. Edmund, she said, and the use of his name still did something to the air, even now, even after 41 days of using it in private, something she was still adjusting to. Both names, he said. It is a Dunmore operation. It was always a Dunmore operation. But without you, there is no operation. He held her gaze. You came here to cook. You got the house out from under a land commissioner's thumb and rebuilt the estate's income before the first winter was out. The estate's name is not enough on those papers. Cecily looked at the contracts. She looked at Edmund. Then add mine, she said. He took the pen from the writing desk and set it beside the first contract. She signed. She moved to the second. Then the third. When she set the pen down, her hand was entirely steady, which meant she was maintaining a composure that was approximately twice removed from what she actually felt. Because what she felt was the kind of thing she did not have a word for. The particular sensation of arriving somewhere you did not know was the destination until you were standing in it. The spring brought changes that none of the household at Dunmore had believed possible the November before. The Keswick contract held. The County Works contract expanded to 2 adjacent drainage projects when Cecily's reputation traveled south ahead of her, which it did because Sergeant Finch's men, reassigned to the new garrison in the spring, carried the story with them the way soldiers carry useful information. The Engineers Corps quartermaster wrote in March requesting an extended arrangement. The income from the provisioning runs, by April, had cleared the outstanding debt on the estate and begun to show a margin that Cecily rendered in a new ledger she had bought in York specifically for the purpose. She hired Pip's aunt as a kitchen maid. The aunt, a widow named Mrs. Rue, had 3 children and had been taking in sewing, and was relieved in a way that she expressed through ferocious competence and a determination to master every recipe Cecily could teach her. Tompkins was promoted. Doyle trained him. It was Doyle who, on the morning of Tompkins's first solo provisioning run, stood at the stable gate and watched the cart go with an expression Cecily had not seen on him before, something that had pride in it. She had been at Dunmore 5 months when she found the letter. It was in the library, in the locked drawer of the writing desk that Edmund had given her the key to in January, saying only that she might find some of the estate correspondence useful for the provisioning history. She had been working through it for a month, and most of what she found was what she expected: old bills of lading, surveyor's letters, land assessments. The letter was at the back of the 3rd folder. It was dated 3 years ago. It was in Edmund's handwriting. It was addressed to no one, unsealed, begun, and apparently never finished, and the body of it concerned a report he had received from a welfare committee in York about the conditions faced by families of discharged soldiers. He had been reading the report, apparently, with the intention of making a donation. He had noted several names from the report. Her father's name was one of them. Her father had sat on that welfare committee. His name appeared in the committee's letter of inquiry attached to the report in the list of signatories. Beside it, In Edmund's hand, in ink that had dried 3 years ago, was a note. Solicitor B. Wren, daughter C. Capable, attends committee in his place on alternate months. Knows the accounts. He had read her name in a welfare report 3 years before she arrived at Dunmore. Cecily sat with the letter for a long time. She set it back in the folder. She returned the folder to the drawer. She turned the key and held it for a moment in her palm. He had known who she was, not from the agency, but before the agency. He had read her name in a document about welfare work for soldiers' families, had noted it beside her father's name, had written that she was capable, and 3 years later had arranged, through a marriage contract drawn up with a domestic agency, for her to come to his estate. She thought about the morning in the kitchen, his face over the inventory, the quiet that was not coldness, the way he had said 12 this morning when she corrected his count of the days, the window in the north tower where he had stood watching the cart come back from the garrison, the hand raised in acknowledgement, the bread he had eaten in silence and stood there a moment longer than he needed to. She closed the drawer. She went and found Edmund in the estate office, where he was in correspondence with Keswick's factor about the summer house extension. He looked up. She set the key on the desk. "I found a letter," she said, "in the library, dated 3 years ago." He looked at the key. He did not touch it. "You were not supposed to find that until I had found the appropriate moment to explain it," he said. And then, after a pause, "There was no appropriate moment. I acknowledged that to myself several weeks ago." Cecily looked at him. She looked at the key on the desk between them. "You read about my father's committee work," she said. "Yes. And my name?" "Yes. Before the agency arranged anything?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I had been looking, through the agency, for someone who could manage what Dunmore needed. Someone with accounts knowledge and household ability, and enough tenacity to survive what the house had become." He looked at her. "Your name appeared in a document about people who work without recognition for causes they believe in, and your father's note in the margin said you had managed his accounts since you were 17, and could read Latin, and had never, in all the time the committee had worked together, missed a single meeting regardless of weather or circumstance." Cecily was very still. "He wrote that," she said. "He wrote that." She pressed her thumb hard against the side of her forefinger and looked at the window. "You arranged for me to come here," she said. "I asked the agency to find someone who matched what I had read. They found 3 candidates. You were among them. I chose you." "Why?" He picked up the key. He turned it in his fingers once and set it back down. "Because your father wrote 'never missed a single meeting regardless of weather or circumstance,'" he said. "And because the other 2 candidates had never managed anything under difficult conditions, and you had managed everything under nothing but difficult conditions for 4 years while your father was ill." He paused. "And because I remembered thinking, when I read his note, that the woman he was describing deserved more than circumstances were giving her." The room was quiet. Outside, one of the provisioning carts was coming back down the drive, and she could hear Tompkins calling something to Pip in the yard. "You have been watching me," Cecily said. "From a distance," he said. "From before you arrived and from an increasing proximity since." He looked at her steadily. "I did not arrange your coming here with any dishonest intention. You were qualified for the position. The position needed filling, but I will not pretend I was indifferent to who you were." She stood in the office for a long moment. She thought about the room the scullery with the onion smell. She thought about Mrs. Farrow's retreating back. She thought about Pip's face the first morning she had taught him his letters, and Tompkins counting the coin box twice in the dark of the North Track, and Sergeant Finch's men eating in the rapid silent focus of people tasting something worth tasting for the first time in weeks. She thought about Edmund's hand raised at the window of the North Tower. She thought about her father writing in a committee margin that his daughter never missed a single meeting regardless of weather or circumstance, and never knowing that 3 years after his death those words would reach the person who needed to hear them. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "I want my name on the estate ledger," she said. "The main ledger, not just the provisioning contracts." A pause. Both names, he said. Both names. Done, he said. He pulled the estate ledger from the shelf beside the desk and set it open on the table and held out the pen. She looked at the open page, the estate's accounts, running back years, in Edmund's hand and in a previous hand before his. She took the pen. She signed. Edmund signed beside her. She set the pen down and looked at both names, side by side on the ledger page, in the afternoon light coming through the estate office window. "You should know," Edmund said, and she turned, and he was closer than he had been a moment ago. Close enough that she could see the quality of his attention properly, the thing behind his eyes that had no obvious name, but had been there since the morning over the inventory, and had not once, looked anywhere else. That I have tried on 3 separate occasions to think of a correct and measured way to tell you that you are the only person who has ever walked into this house and made it feel like it intends to stay standing. Cecily looked at him. 3 occasions, she said, at minimum. And each time I concluded that I had not yet found the correct and measured way. You have not found it now either, she said. No, he agreed. But I have found that I prefer honesty in most things. He paused. And I have found that I would very much rather you stayed. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had read her name in a welfare report 3 years ago, and written that she deserved more than circumstances were giving her, and who had stood at a North Tower window watching a provisioning cart come home, and who had handed her a pen and said both names and meant it. I told you in November, she said, that I do not leave things unfinished. You did. This is not finished. No, he said, I rather thought not. Cecily put the pen back in its stand and looked at the ledger, both names in black ink on the open page, and felt for the first time since the agent in York had told her to look at a kitchen and see a storefront that she was standing exactly where she had been going. That summer, the whole Dunmore household gathered at the long, scarred table in the kitchen for a meal that bore no resemblance to what any of them had been eating the autumn before. Watts and Doyle and Tompkins and Pip and Mrs. Rue and her 3 children and Mrs. Farrow, who had arrived at a sort of grudging armistice in the months since Prentice's visit, and who sat at the far end of the table with the expression of a woman who had revised several of her opinions without necessarily advertising the fact. Doyle, who had not said an unnecessary word in the entire time Cecily had been at Dunmore, raised his cup. I called her the cook, he said, to no one in particular, and then he turned to Cecily. I did think she'd last the fortnight. Told Tompkins so. You did, Tompkins said. She outlasted my opinion of her. He turned his cup in his rough old hands. She outlasted Prentice. She outlasted the rats in the larder. She outlasted me complaining about my back. He looked at Edmund. And she fed 43 men and 2 garrison companies and the Earl of Keswick's summer house workers and cleared every debt this estate has carried for 6 years. He put the cup back down, so I won't make a speech about it. You all know the numbers. Pip stood up on his chair. He was 9 now and had been attempting to grow into the self-possession of a boy who had been taught to read by a woman who also negotiated contracts with earls. I knew first, he said, about the garrison. There was a general noise of agreement around the table, and Cecily laughed, and Edmund, sitting beside her, looked down the length of the crowded table at all of it, at the children and the old groom and the earnest footman and the boy standing on the chair, and turned to look at her. You came here to cook, he said, quiet enough that only she heard it, and you built us all a future instead. Cecily looked at the table. She looked at the ledger on the shelf above the hearth, both names in the spine. I came here to cook, she said, and I found considerably more than I was arranging for. He took her hand under the table, the way a man holds a thing he has been waiting for long enough to know how to hold it carefully, and outside the long windows of Dunmore Hall, the evening light came down gold across the North Parkland, where the provisioning carts sat loaded and ready for the morning run, and somewhere in the distance called once across the fields, and the kitchen was full and warm and entirely changed from what it had been, and none of them, not even Mrs. Farrow, looked like they were going anywhere at all.